Well, hello, hello. Welcome to the Lolo and Perry Come Follow Me podcast. How are you doing, Lolo?
I am doing great. I am
You
currently driving,
you are coming
which
to
is
us with a
super
with an
fun.
intense picture here.
Yes, that's because I'm really excited for today's episode. That's why.
You should
It's
be.
going
You
to be a
should be.
blast.
We are finally in the large plates, and this is just one of those big happy transition points where we are finally running with what the Book of Mormon started with. We are at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, if you can believe that. Uh, let's see here. We are going through Mosiah 1 through 6. We're going to combine a couple of sections together because we're trying to kind of get caught up from where we fell behind. Before we dive into that, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. So I mentioned before, we're going to be having some changes kind of on our end, on my end anyway. And that's going to allow me a bit more time to do some additional projects. So far on the docket, I do have a plan of addressing Mormonism with the Murphs, top 10 evidences for the Book of Mormon. He released a video this last week on that.
Ooh, that's
So
going to be good.
I'll either do that video or the Saints Unscripted video with the top 5. I'm leaning towards the longer top 10 version. That'll probably be like a 4-hour long video if I'm being honest with you. So buckle down. It'll be a good time. And then the other one that I'm looking to try to do is addressing the Lars Nielsen, how the Book of Mormon really came to pass theory. And
That was
I'll
a painful, painful,
yeah,
painful thing to watch.
so when I just saw him on Mormonish podcast, I was leaning in the direction of actually picking up the book, reading through it, going through like in detail, doing a detailed response. Um, as it
Oh,
stands after the Mormonism live episode, I'm not leaning in
yeah.
that direction anymore. And that has to do with his presentation, with how he chose to go about presenting his theory, the way that he chose to present his facts and his case. And so that is very much in a response to the decisions and the way that he is choosing to present. I am not necessarily inclined to giving him any of my hard-earned cash in addressing what I think is a very problematic theory just on the surface. So I'll address the details there that he presents in Mormonish and in Mormonism Live. But I'm not going to go into the book beyond what's available as a free sample on Amazon, and I've read through that already, and it's not that
Um,
much different from what he showed.
Pirating is wrong, and I
Pirating.
would never suggest such a thing. Um, but
the,
not unlike how Joseph Smith was blessed with free literature, only he had to dig in the ground under a rock and some stuff to get his free literature. I had to ask my cousin, and I have also been blessed with free literature that I will share with you.
are you saying that if I were to take like a stone, like a smooth like river rock, and put it in a hat, that I too may be able to receive free literature?
Yes, but I
Okay.
will make you go be attacked in the woods by, I'm assuming, a bad ayahuasca trip before I will let you do that part, though. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, I thought you were going to say be attacked by 3 different individuals holding guns as I'm running past carrying 50 pounds of metal. But yeah, no, a bad ayahuasca trip can also
I was
work.
going to surprise you with the other parts. Now you've ruined it.
No, I've ruined it.
But yeah, I will. I will share my blessings of free literature with you.
Sounds good. So those two videos are on the docket for a June July timeframe. I have in my head working on a little bit of like a short story, a little bit of writing that I may also present as like a reading of some sort. I'm not really sure how I want to go about doing that, but I have sort of an allegory for the plan of salvation as taught by the Brighamites, and some of the interesting issues that show up in that when you actually put the rubber to the road, when you actually explore it. Anyway, that's just an idea that I'm currently fomenting, and I do expect to work out something this summer. So just a handful of things to look forward to on that end, before we kind of get into the episode proper.
Very, very, very cool. I'm excited to hear. I have read your writings, not these particular writings, but I have read your other writings, and you're one hell of a talented writer.
Well, thank
So
you.
I'm excited
Thank
for
you.
that.
I wish I had the ability to really like market myself in a proper ways, and then maybe I could actually have some success with my writing. But I mean, if our viewership numbers are anything to go off of, my SEO skills are. Uh, we do appreciate the audience that does show up, for the record. Like, when you guys are here watching this, like, we really do appreciate you being here. This is fun. We're doing this for ourselves. And the viewership numbers thing is in no way, shape, or form a sore point for it. We're just having a good time here. But
Oh, totally. And
yeah, but
Tyler, I
in
will say I've
acknowledging.
learned. Fair, that's fair. I will say I've learned more from you than anything I ever learned in school or from my parents. No hate on my parents, but you're also very knowledgeable. So I'm doing this for free knowledge. So just saying,
And
that's another reason.
this is a great place for me to kind of like vent some of my frustrations about apologetics and things like that too. So, and even some criticisms. Like, there are some critical opinions that I want to vent frustrations about, and we've had some of that in this podcast. So that's been fun.
You mean twice baked Sidney Rigdon theories and
That
such?
one is a big one. The other, I mean, we also talked about like the self-insert characters in the Book of
Oh yeah,
Mormon and stuff like that. Like, there's just these critical arguments. I find them obnoxious. They come from a place of recognizing that the Book of Mormon is not what it claims to be, but they are presented in ways that miss the point. They miss the philosophical framework that a believer is operating from, and so you're trying to answer like an apologetic claim within this critical argument that has nothing to actually do with what the apologetic claim is, and
yeah.
that's a little bit obnoxious to me. I don't begrudge anybody who does that like independent, like on their own, how that's their way of handling it. But when you're kind of entering into these like dialogues with apologists, that's where it grates on me a bit. Or when you
Yeah.
engage in dialogue with true believers, like that, yeah, that's where it does it for me. Not in the like, if you're talking with other critics, like, yeah, I agree with you about this thing, but
Yeah.
yeah.
It's all in
Okay.
how you come at it, I think.
Approach has a lot to do with it, and it comes down to like, what are we talking about? Like, what are we actually discussing in this section? And when I see critics doing the same thing that I see apologists doing, it's annoying at best. And we're going to talk about some apologetics in this episode where, like, what are they talking about comes up quite a bit, because the apologists are conflating things that really have nothing to do with each other, or making claims that are I don't really want to accuse them of being dishonest, but it is intellectually
Yeah.
dishonest, the way that it's presented. And yeah, so we're going to see some of that. And when I see critics doing the same thing, it drives me nuts. So
I mean, it's if you're wanting somebody to come at what you're saying and see your point of view with any kind of a feeling that it's a legitimate thought process and a legitimate theory, putting untrue information in your theory is going to be the fastest way to have somebody lose any legitimacy for me.
right. And so yeah, putting like the untruths in there, I agree with you. Like, if you get something in there that you are, especially if you're basing like important points on that like untrue idea, yeah, it's going to kill your legitimacy. What's even like, I think, more egregious in my estimation is when you take something that is very technically correct, very technically true, but it hides the thing. It's done to hide the thing that you're actually trying to engage with. It hides like you're basically trying to say that it says like this point, you're trying to elevate it to being to this standard. And while it says something that is like parallel to that, it's on a
Yeah.
completely different wavelength. It has nothing to actually do with the thing that you say or are trying to indicate that it has to do
Yes,
with.
exactly.
Yeah, and that's where it bugs me. We're gonna see an example of that in this episode, so we'll kind of point that out then. Um, yeah. Anyway, it's a little bit different than like the kind of annoying apologetics you get from like a Brian Hales, where he goes through and he shows exactly why the Book of Mormon could be understood to be an automatically written text. Um, in very good detail, like excellent scholarship that shows like that is a good way of approaching the text, and then challenges that on, but where do the words come from? It's like, okay, well now you're just being silly, but like at least you're
Right.
like showing everything here.
Right.
So
There's attempts, but
as much as Brian Hales like annoys me, I have to give him credit with that, where at least like he does, at least in that paper, put forward things honestly, and pretty completely. It's just the way that he tries to deal with it is where the nonsense comes in, and it's whatever. It's
and I mean honestly, I tried. Sorry. I tried to hear him. I
Mhm.
wanted to give him an opportunity, and at least even if I didn't agree with him, I wanted to give him the opportunity for me to go, "Huh, that is
Yeah.
an interesting way of seeing that." But
Mhm.
he's so, yeah, I just,
Yeah.
I couldn't.
It-
I couldn't.
what did it for me is when he was on with Michelle Stone on the 132 Problems thing, where they tried to deny Joseph Smith's polygamy and
Oh my
that whole messed up
gosh.
situation. But when Brian Hales so thoroughly gets me and like Maven and others like on her side, that should be a real
I
testament
was
to
gonna
just
say
how
at that point, we have to kind of go, bro, I think you missed the mark a little bit.
yeah, you gotta like figure out how you're gonna do this, because like your points we agree with you on this issue, but like we're on her side on this episode because of how badly you're handling this. Yeah, that was an occurrence. Okay, let's get into the meat of the episode here. Enough preamble. So last week we had Omni, that whole thing, and we had Amalekite at the very end giving the plates, the small plates, over to King Benjamin. And this is important because it will show up as an issue later on in this chapter, where it's going to create some narrative inconsistencies. Um, this is also, in terms of the Mosaic priority theory, where the dictation that we have today, like the actual text of the Book of Mormon as we have it today, began, where that process started. So what we see in this text is something that, or in this part of the text, reflects Joseph's earlier style and some of his earlier word choices. And you compare this up with like sections in the Doctrine and Covenants that were revealed before Oliver Cowdery comes on board, and then we'll see this slow drift over time to more of the sound that we have in the small plates.
Okay.
I think it would be interesting to do a series reading the Book of Mormon from Mosiah through to Words of Mormon, and checking that drift as it goes along. That is not the purpose of our series here. But I would like to see somebody do that. And if anybody decides that they want to do that and they want to have me participate, like that would be awesome. I would totally be willing
Oh,
to
that
join
would be
somebody in that endeavor.
amazing.
Um, that is not going to be the purpose of this podcast. We're going through this Come Follow Me manual for really for the search engine optimization, honestly, more than anything else.
I guess
So
so. This is not, because I'm always so great at staying right on topic and never, ever going astray. Explain to me, why not just start with Benjamin? Like, why? Why?
mm.
Why
So
not just start at that point? If you start with Mosiah, that's a great start. We've got like King Benjamin and the make your tent face the temple. Woo! Like
you've
it's
actually got a story
very,
there. So the reason, I mean, the obvious reason is that Joseph needed to have the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas be descended from Hebrews, and that is like the three things that the Book of Mormon is consistently trying to achieve. That is one of the top ones, right? And that is like one of the big items here on this list. The other thing is like we have to have Jesus coming over to America as well, like, and then we have to like have the people who were here like go from a state of like grace, having rejected that state of grace, being in a state of like filth and decay and all of that, as the white settlers would have seen the indigenous inhabitants in their very racist perspective on that whole thing, as they're trying to justify, right? They're trying to go out
Yeah.
and justify this expansion and the destruction and all that they're causing to these people. So the very obvious reason is that if you start with Benjamin, you don't get that narrative of the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas coming from Jerusalem,
Yeah. That's
coming from
fair.
Israel. The other reason, though, is that because the dictation starts with Lehi, um, like the full overall process starts with Lehi, and that whole story, um, you've got to come back eventually to that issue. Once he loses those 116 pages, he's got to come back around to that issue. And starting with Mosiah and these stories is just kind of a way of creating some time to come up with that
Yeah.
solution. And it's by about April 1829 or so that he actually has that solution roughly
So we
worked
can
out.
blame Martin Harris for a lot
Small
of
plates.
this. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing.
I
The small plates are the second go around, which means in theory it should be better than when it was done the first time. Uh,
I
we
feel like
haven't.
that is not what happened. And every morning of early morning seminary, my apologies, Freudian slip. Every morning of early morning seminary, I just want to tell you how many times I wanted to punch Martin Harris, because
Martin
those were
Harris, dum
some
dum dum.
tough mornings.
Yeah.
His his fault.
So, I mean, to an extent, right? I mean, we have to have Joseph responsible for his own decisions here, but
Oh no, like
um,
I mean, he's got a. They are equally yoked, to quote scripture in my book.
yeah, no, it's Martin Harris and the loss of the 116 pages definitely created some angst in this story and some complications. And again, the the only section that Joseph Smith writes twice is what we now have as the small plates. That is the only place that edits could have occurred, that changes, modifications could have happened, and we have no ideas what those would be. So I'm not trying to say that like we can make any like scholarly or critical claims based off of those discrepancies. But apologists love to go through with this like whole idea of, well, he was only ever able to do it, one time. There were no edits, no revisions, none of that. Like, well, very technically, for the first, 150 pages or so of the Book of Mormon, yeah, he had a second draft. And this is what we get out of that.
We need to
Yeah.
talk to his creative writing teacher.
Have a long conversation with Oliver Cowdery about like, keeping your guy in check a little bit. Um, yeah. So the problem is that as much as we're trying to, disparage the small plates a little bit here and the slog of the small plates, the large plates are they do reflect a first-time writer. I will say that the way that the narrative is structured in the large plates is very consistent with a first-time author, just kind of doing his best, and not really making kind of needed edits. Um, and stuff like characters like being like named characters showing up one time and then completely disappearing from the record. um like, did you know that Benjamin had three sons, and other than Mosiah he also had Haloram and Helaman? That's named Helaman's going to keep showing up over and over and over again, by the way.
I didn't
These
know
other
about the three
these
sons.
these other two sons completely disappear. They get mentioned in Mosiah 1, they disappear. In
It's like
Alma,
that
you'll
little sister on those sitcoms that the little sister's there for only like the first season and then nobody ever talks about her again.
right. There's a character named Aha in Alma who is named as one of these spies for some reason. Other like there's no real narrative reason to actually name these spies, but these spies get named and then they're not mentioned again the entire record.
He did not
Yeah,
name a spy. Aha.
I'm pretty sure that he did.
That's amazing. I
I
love
mean, I can
it.
check in a day or two.
I mean,
Um,
still, that's, I love that. 10 out of 10. Good job.
right,
Perfect naming.
So, interesting. Interesting. Okay. There's some interesting things that my eyes catch on to that I wasn't necessarily noticing the first time around. It's fine. We've discussed Egyptian in the Book of Mormon before. We're going to jump into some of the apologetics that show up in this section. So we're all kind of familiar. I think, like those of us who have read the Book of Mormon, the story comes up so much in the conversations about the like various events of the Book of Mormon that I think Mosiah's sermon and the people having their whole like come to Jesus moment and all that's pretty well understood. So for the purposes of the rest of this, we're going to assume you know the story and the gist of it. And we're going to dive into the apologetic side of it. So there are two categories of apologetics that come up here that I've heard plenty of times. I've heard Stephen Murphy, Mormonism with the Murph, raise this one multiple times in his episodes. It's some like the evidence that points to like the ancient origin of the Book of Mormon. And so I do want to give that some service here, some treatment here, and that is that the speech by King Benjamin represents a liturgical representation of the Feast of Tabernacles in the New World, and then the second is that the coronation of Mosiah II follows the pattern of Israelite kings and how they're coronated. And these two are kind of in parallel, and they each have influences from Jack Welch. So make of that, I suppose, what you will. I hear Jack Welch's name enough in these apologetic spaces that I don't have enough of a coherent model of what he's all about to really know if I should dismiss him out of hand or not, kind of like I would like Nibley or Guy or Muhlestein. But I do have enough experience running into his stuff to say, well, at least he's going to make something that's going to cause me to do a little bit of a double take here. So,
and I like that. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I appreciate a different point of view when approached properly.
Yep. Him and Skousen are a couple that will like typically when they pop up, they'll cause me to have to do a little bit of extra work to address the apologetic more so than I would usually have to, which I do appreciate. Like when we get into Helaman and we start talking about if and conditionals, I am going to be both cursing and praising Skousen. Like it's a thing, and I have done more research into that than I ever would have thought that I would have. And anyway, it's fun. Okay. So, with respect first to the Feast of Tabernacles, there's a few points that come up from the apologists, and we'll have the links in the notes to this episode that you can check out kind of what the apologists pointing out. There's a table though in Meridian Magazine that compares like these features of the Feast of Tabernacles to King Benjamin's speech. And you've got like traveling to the temple, you have remaining in booths, tents, the speakers on a platform, there are sacrifices, you read the law, you have the blood of the covenant applied to the people, there's blessings, there's curses, and there's some sort of ritual response to this whole thing. These are the features that they're going to point out that show up.
Mhm.
What they're going to completely ignore from this is that the whole Feast of the Tabernacles was 7 days in Jerusalem, like in Israel. But if you were in the diaspora, which very technically, whether or not this concept had actually developed, I'm not 100% certain. I think that this is maybe a second temple innovation. But if you were in the diaspora, then it was an 8-day celebration, which
Oh,
for the Nephites, then, assuming that they understood themselves to be in the diaspora, means that that should have been an 8-day event. There's nothing in the text of the Book of Mormon that indicates this 7-day time frame. In fact, it seems to be kind of maybe 2 or 3 days
I would
at
have
most.
never. Yeah, I was gonna say when I imagined it, it wasn't nearly that long.
Yeah, it doesn't have the feel of being a week-long event.
Yeah.
And while they do bring their sacrifices, excuse me, it's the sacrifices that are described as belonging to like the Day of Atonement. So when you would bring
Right.
like the firstlings of your flock for the purpose of like the Day of Atonement, the Day of Atonement is not during the Feast of Tabernacles. It's at a different time of the year. Um, it's like 6, 7 months later, something like that. Anyway, like it's just the wrong time of the year for that. So Feast of Tabernacles is an autumnal festival, and you're celebrating the harvest and all of that. I mean, there are things about this that are like very common to these like agrarian cultures that we see
Mhm.
vestiges of today in our own culture. Like there's still stuff that we do around like the equinoxes and all of that
I
because
was
of these
gonna
events.
say, like, so how familiar would Joseph Smith have been with
With the Feast of
the
Tabernacles.
feast? Yeah.
Yeah, so the from what I've heard from apologists, that they really want this to be some like very obscure festival that isn't really well understood until much later, um, as they always want to do. This shows up in quite a few places in the Bible, but it's a pretty minor like festival in the mix. Like it doesn't get a whole lot of screen time, but it does get some. And John 7 is actually set during the Feast of Tabernacles. Um,
Oh.
and the way that that plays out in the New Testament is narratively completely different from what we have in Mosiah 2 through 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, where the Book of Mormon tends to have literary dependencies on Genesis, Isaiah, Paul, and the Gospels,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I don't think that Joseph was very familiar with the Feast of Tabernacles. So I'm going to grant to the apologist that I don't think that Joseph would have been too terribly aware of it. But he did have access to materials that would have given him at least some information about the event. Um, but it's fine. I don't think that this lines up very well with the Feast of Tabernacles anyway.
Right. I
Um,
was gonna say that doesn't. I was gonna. My next
yeah,
point was, I guess, but it really doesn't matter because, and
right.
then
You have like
you
this
read my
this
mind.
whole other like type of event. It it's not until the Second Temple period where like the Exodus story really gets attached to this, um, and how it would have been celebrated during the First Temple is still kind of a matter of scholarly research, I suppose. It's
Right.
a very
Right.
open area of research for First Temple. Just First Temple records are sparse.
I was gonna say there
Um,
just isn't enough information, really.
Right, right. And we can kind of look at like some of the texts that are written before the exile to maybe get a bit of a picture of it.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, it's pretty sparse on what we actually know about the event in the first temple as it would have been undertaken by the Nephites. Um,
Right.
and the other thing too is that they built this kind of like lean-to type structure. It's got like these like two walls and a partial wall, and then like the roof is
Yeah.
like covered with like this like grassy material or like leafy stuff that's just kind of thrown over the top of it. Like
Right.
these aren't
It was.
really tents. And from what I understand, it was meant to be kind of open a little bit, so you could look up into like the stars,
Oh,
or look. It was supposed to have like some connection with those events. Um,
okay.
that might be a modern innovation or a modern change to it as well. Like
Mhm.
the festival has definitely changed, and most of the information on it is from like modern times. Um,
Right.
so, and I am in no way, shape, or form a scholar of anything, let alone Jewish festivals. But what I have described it by Jewish people and by the Hebrew Bible
Mhm.
sounds different enough from this event, from the King Benjamin speech, that while there are
Yeah.
some superficial similarities, there are also significant differences that just need like they would need to be addressed in order for this to gain any real
Yeah.
acceptance. What's more likely is that this is inspired by 19th century Christian revivals, where you
I
would
was
have
fixing to
people.
say that to me, it sounds a whole lot more like,
Right.
um, fun fact, that is still what happens down here. I have an uncle who is a very, very energetic Pentecostal preacher. And every summer they have a festival. I don't know that I would call it a festival, but it's everybody comes out and they pitch their tents and we cook. And yes, that
Yep.
is still very much in the South. And it
And
always,
you
I
build a
just thought it was funny.
you build a stage and all of that, so that way you can be heard and noticed by the audience. And then you're going to do some stuff
Right.
where you're going to talk about Jesus, and then you're going to exhort people to
Mm-hmm.
do good things. And
Yep.
then, right, like these things all line up very, very well with 19th century American Protestantism, like
Yeah.
beautifully well. It's harder to align these things with the Feast of Tabernacles,
Yeah.
and the narrative purposes of the Feast of Tabernacles also doesn't really jive. And I know there's going to be
Yeah.
like if some apologist who really cares about this is in our viewership right now, they're probably screaming at me that well, actually, like if you look at this, the coronations, or if you look in Ezra where it talks about this, or when you look at like all right, relax, like even in those cases what we're talking about is still like quite a bit different, because here we have a guy who's going up talking about like Jesus at this event
Which
where
was
he's old
always so
dude.
confusing. Yes.
Like you have an old dude who loves Jesus, who had an angel visit him, who's talking to his people because he's about to die and he's preparing for that transition. Like this is it's old king passes or abdicates power to new king. And while it's an interesting story, and while there's something to be said for like whatever influences may have been at play and all of that, this isn't something that would have been so far outside of the stretch of Joseph's ability to conceive that this other explanation really merits a whole lot of like consideration at present, which is not.
So
Yeah,
I would like to interject a little bit there.
sure.
So, especially in the deeper South, when you have a congregation, especially a tight knit, you know, uh, uh, congregation, the the pastorhood or the preacher position is normally passed down father to son.
Hmm.
And when you have Papa getting ready to go meet his maker, they will tend to have big kind of gatherings so that the father reverend is passing the torch essentially.
Hmm.
So that is very common when you have that going, and it's not uncommon to have a congregation that's been father to son for several generations preaching.
Right. Right. And I mean, that fits the Book of Mormon pattern very, very well. And not like in some like parallel mania sense either. It's like, no, this is just what Joseph would have understood. He's the most likely author of the Book of Mormon. So he'd be pulling from his milieu to construct like these ideas. And here we can see like that manifest in the text. Um, I think that that fits better, honestly, than the Feast of Tabernacles, which it doesn't like there's just not enough textual data that supports the idea that it's the Feast of Tabernacles. You've got some superficial details that do align. There's much more textual evidence that aligns with exactly with what you're talking about. We have the
Yeah.
retiring pastor who's passing up the torch down to his son, and we're going to keep this congregation going. And hey, if there's
Yeah.
any new ones here, like come accept Jesus as your savior, be saved, all of
Mhm.
that, and that's what we have in the narrative of this text.
Well, and that was
Um,
my point when I asked, like, how familiar would he have even been with the Feast of Tabernacles? Because
right.
that doesn't really seem like what a country boy Protestant, in the 1800s would just know about,
Right, right. And so like if he was describing like in detail the Feast of Tabernacles, and if he had like sort of like nuanced details that aligned with that event, and there was actual like textual support really getting into it, and stuff aligned, and he understood stuff like that's an 8-day event in the diaspora, which is how it would have been understood for the Nephites, is that they're in the diaspora, they're not in Jerusalem, they're not in the Holy Land, they're outside of that. Like that would be one thing, but he doesn't seem to have that. The text doesn't have that understanding,
Right.
um, and so I just don't see that reflected, and so I don't see this apologetic necessarily holding up. There's a big long paper by Jay Tevendez on this that people are also welcome to read through. I found it to be um, I mean, there's some of the biblical stuff is interesting in it, but when it came to the Book of Mormon stuff, it just seemed to be really presumptive of its own conclusion.
Yeah.
And then in its conclusion section, where it's like, oh, we can't really be conclusive about anything, and there's all these other questions, it does so not to say that there are like questions that we would need to address to really substantiate this hypothesis or this reading of the text, but more from a, well, what can this reading of the text tell us about First Temple Judaism or the transition into Second
Right.
Temple Judaism, which like so much else was going on to influence Second Temple Judaism that like the
Right.
Nephites leaving is not going to be the thing. Anyway, and the Nephites
Well,
also would have changed this so much in 400 years in their own
well, and
events, right?
right, and I mean, I understand what the point that the apologists are trying to make, but
Yeah,
here's my point. He makes it a little bit too easy. I mean, because you could have legitimately taken King Benjamin out of that and put Pastor Ralph, and
hmm,
it's gonna have the exact same effect. And it's the point is, if you can look at this and see so blatantly where it's coming from, either they're not trying hard enough, or there's really not going to
yeah,
be any other way that you can answer that.
right, right, yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree with all that, and I think that apologists they're trying hard to find ways of making the Book of Mormon seem that it comes from an ancient source rather than it coming from Joseph Smith. But again, like you've got to the first step in this is not to like leap to what can the Book of Mormon tell us about these other like scholarly questions. The first step is to say, okay, what have we done and what work still needs to be done to distinguish this from this is of the mind of Joseph Smith, because
And it would make so much more sense if they would take that point and go, you know what? So what if it is from Joseph Smith? So what if Joseph Smith
right.
wrote it? And who cares if it's automatic writing, ayahuasca, or whatever you want to call, however he got there, that doesn't diminish any of the good stuff that it teaches.
Right.
It doesn't
Which is in
have
the
to
section.
be right. It's like, come
Like,
on, guys. Okay, I'm done.
no, you're good. Can we talk just for a second here about Mosiah 4 and the injunction here to care for the poor? Like, this becomes one of, like, I think one of the most beautiful sections of the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
Like, this, seriously, this is, I think, out of like everything the Book of Mormon teaches, this may be the most beautiful section out of all of it, where God created you. whom are you dependent for your lives and all that you have? Everything that he grants to you that is right and faith, like he's going to give you all this. So like with that, ye ought to impart of the substance that ye have one to another.
Yeah.
And if ye judge the man who putteth up his petition to you for your substance, that he perish not, and condemn him, how much more just will your condemnation be for withholding your substance? And like this is a beautiful, beautiful screed against like not caring for the poor, against capitalism, against like,
Yeah.
and frankly, against the way that the modern church, the modern mainline Brighamite church is hoarding its wealth. The fact that there are
I
like
was
people in
about to
Utah,
say.
yeah, the fact that there are people in Utah who like freeze to death instead of being like allowed into like church-run homeless shelters is just morally reprehensible,
Yes.
especially considering the wealth that the church possesses. Like
Yes.
there should not be a single unhoused person in the state of Utah. There just shouldn't be.
No.
And the fact that there are is, yeah, it's morally abominable. And that is in light of the
Yeah.
teachings in the Book of Mormon. Like
I
10
was
out of
speaking
10
with
on this one, Joseph.
somebody. Oh, yeah. I was speaking with somebody, and I was like, the point was the church had the money to build an entirely new tabernacle that sits empty while
Mm-hmm.
it is so far below freezing and they're unhoused persons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. I mean, there are like models for like solving world hunger that cost like $7 billion. The church could like take care of that overnight, Like imagine what the church could have done to like get to they probably could not have funded everything associated with getting like the COVID vaccines rolled out, but they could have made a huge, huge
Oh,
dent in that whole process.
massive
Like
difference.
there are all these things. And instead they enriched themselves during that time. They were one of those like stock option holders that was like really upset about the Game Stonks fiasco. Like like
That makes me happy.
meanwhile they're getting the SEC fines. They're fighting city council so that way they can put up these tall steeples in for their temples, which suddenly are part of the worship, wherever that came from. By the way, city of McKinney or city of Fairview, if you're listening to this, there is no religious basis for the temple steeples needing to be a certain height or anything of the sort. There is nothing in the religion that mandates that at
Really?
all. Yeah, whole thing. Anyway,
I did not know that. That's interesting.
there's nothing like wait, well, we never heard about steeples. Like who's never
That's
anything
true.
like the only time where a steeple has really mattered in Mormonism, at least in mainline Brighamite Mormonism, is the Salt Lake Temple, where it has like the specific symbolic function
Right. It's
of
got a
the different
reason.
of the priesthood, right? Like
Yeah.
it's oriented a certain way, and all that it's symbolic of the priesthood. Like it serves a specific religious
Right.
function. If all the temples were modeled that way, I might grant that point. But the Mesa Temple, as an example, does not have a steeple, and it is fine. Like it's supposed
I
to look
was
more
gonna
like Solomon's
say,
temple.
is it less temple-y than, like Washington, or is it like not as, oh, you went to that, yeah, they don't have a
I
steeple.
mean,
You're
yeah, I guess if you got your endowments taken out at the Mesa Temple, or if you were sealed at the Mesa Temple, your ordinances are invalid. So, since it doesn't have a steeple,
doesn't have a steeple.
uh,
Sorry, guys.
anyway, I sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole of things that it's like this particular issue has come up, and it's a reflection of other problems, and that's why I'm talking about it. Because honestly, I
I
don't care
have
if they build a temple
followed
with a steeple, but
I have followed your train of thought. So if you're crazy, I'm crazy with you. So
all right. Well, then we can go down on that ship together. Um, so yeah, the issue for me is that the Book of Mormon offers, I think, one of the most explicit and one of the most beautiful treatises on how we should be treating the poor, and that is not reflected in the institutional church. And this is just another one of those like blatant pieces of evidence that you cannot find mainline Brighamite Mormonism anywhere in the Book of Mormon. So that's my issue.
No, I'm with you.
Okay, let's go on to another apologetic. And this is the coronation of King Mosiah following the pattern of other Israelite kings. And this is actually a Welch's Best article with John Welch, which is Jack Welch, and Greg Welch. And again, this is one of those things that we'll share the link to this. It's on the Book of Mormon Central's website, and they've got essentially what amounts to a table showing what the Israelite pattern was of coronation, and then how the Book of Mormon is parallel or adapts it. Which in theory means we should have this sort of like, articulation of what the Israelites would do, and then we should see how the Book of Mormon is meeting that or is adapting to the circumstances of the people to achieve the same function.
Correct.
I want to be very clear here that they should be achieving the same function. There shouldn't be like any sort of like wonkiness with this. Anyway, okay. So we have in the Israelite pattern, the sanctuary is the site of the coronation, which in this case actually lines up incredibly well. They are gathered at the temple for this whole event to occur, right? So we have King Benjamin's speech, then we have his application and consecration of Mosiah II. This is happening at the temple during this feast. We're in good shape here on this point. The king stood on a royal dais or platform. Okay, Benjamin is standing on a tower, so we do have sort of a match. My issue with this one is that the tower is like it kind of, at least in the text, appears to be an impromptu construction. It would not have been built if not so many people had come to the city.
Well, because in the revivals, it is something that is built as part of the community, the community gathering beforehand.
Right. And I think that what we're seeing in this case, to kind of tie in with like the revival event, is that we have this call out for what it will amount to a religious revival. And we're expecting a certain audience. And then suddenly that audience ends up being way bigger than anything we anticipated. And so now we have to create this adaptation. And in a modern revival, what you would do is you might mess around with your sound system a little bit, or you might need to get your fire permits updated or something like that. Like our sound technology is such you don't have to do a whole lot of changes. But for folks in, before the invention of the microphone and speaker system, you would need to create something like a tower, something that would allow somebody to try and get better acoustic so they can project out further and be heard by more people.
Right.
And so this is an adaptation where they're like, oh my goodness, we weren't expecting this. Well, we need to make a change here nice and quickly. And I think that it's intended to show that they were not expecting such a large audience, and yet there was this response. And I think it's serving that narrative tool while still fitting into that revival sense. Like this is a truly exceptional revival.
Got it.
And it's like, and then even with that, right? So like even with the tower and all the acoustic advantage that provides, not everybody can hear, so they still have it all written down and passed among the people so they can read what's discussed.
Now, am I remembering correctly? Were there not? And I'm not sure if I remember this from the scriptures or from my seminary teacher. Shout out to Sister Pippin. What? Were there callers? So, like King Benjamin would say ABC, and then as far as his voice would carry, at that point there would be somebody else who would listen to what he said and then call it out so that the people even further back could hear.
I believe that
real?
I believe that the text says, let's see. Okay, so here it is in verse 8. It came to pass that he began to speak to his people. They could not all hear his words because of the greatness of the multitude. Therefore he caused that the words which he spake should be written and sent forth among those that were not under the sound of his voice, that they might also receive his words. So it does not appear that a caller's method was used. It seems that it is assuming a very literate society, and that the words were written and then passed down to the people who were outside of the range.
I'm sorry for calling Sister Pippin out then, and my bad, Sister Pippin. If that is not
Yeah,
what you taught us, I made it up. But if it is what you taught us, ooh, shame on you. You should have read
yeah.
King Benjamin's words. You were too busy.
This is actually a very common problem in discussing the Book of Mormon, the scriptures, frankly, with other people, is that people will say, well, it says this in the text, and then you actually dive into that section. It's like, it doesn't actually say that. Like, it's saying this other thing, and I can see why you would get that interpretation, but that's not what it's actually saying here.
Well, and I was also a sleep deprived 15-year-old.
I
So,
I think that what's going on here too is that that Joseph is trying to create this justification for how this speech was preserved. Um, and so he's going through, he's explaining the background information, and then the speech has to be preserved somehow. And the way that it was preserved, because you're not etching it in metal as he's talking, right? So there had to be some way of keeping this protected. And the way that you go about doing that is transcribing as he's speaking, which is now a method that Joseph himself is quite familiar with.
oh yeah, the pamphlets, big time.
Well, I meant just like in the writing of the Book of Mormon itself, like he now has experience with having his stuff transcribed as he's talking. Like
Oh, but
he
in
is
the
per.
revivals, that
Oh
was
yeah,
also, you would get the pamphlets, and the pamphlets told you everything that you had just listened to for the last 3 days.
yeah, perfect. So I mean, there are a lot of harmonies. I think this is more parsimonious with it being a Nephite revival than with it being a Nephite Feast of Tabernacles. Again, but staying on the coronation as best as we're able. There's not a whole
I'm
lot
not
here,
just,
honestly.
I'm so sorry for my
No, you're
tangent.
good. You're good. I went down that tangent too. So it's um, so again, we had the building of the tower and it being parallel. Again, the king is on a raised platform. It's fine. That lines up with the Israelite pattern very technically, but the narrative purpose of that tower and the way of that platform and the way that raised platform appeared is quite a bit different than what we see in the Israelite pattern for the coronation of kings.
Yeah.
So installing an office with insignia is the other point or one of the other points that Welch raises. And we have Benjamin giving Mosiah the records, Sword of Laban, and the Liahona. And just to be clear, in terms of the narrative structure, that pattern had long since already been established. This isn't anything that's remarkable. This is a father giving his son the stuff, right, that
Right.
needs to be passed along.
The
Um,
tools of the family trade.
Right. There isn't anything that's like necessarily talking about like the king's insignia or anything like that. Um, Obviously, we're going through a coronation, but there's not anything about this particularly Israelite, um, and that would be needed or even ancient. Like you would see something like this in the coronation of the King of England, um, and so this is not outside of Joseph's like milieu
Right.
in any stretch. They're also talking about the two stones that Mosiah has in this section, as though those would have been given to him at the time of his coronation. That is inference more than anything else.
Hmm.
And also, this is we'll get into the stones when we get to later into Mosiah, and we start talking about the role
Right.
of a seer in the Book of Mormon. Um, the king is anointed. Cool. That's fine. The king is also anointed in the English tradition.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, we just saw King Charles and all of that and his freaky painting.
I was gonna say.
But like, yeah, like the consecration of the king is something that continues into the modern day. This isn't something that's
Oh yeah.
particularly Israelite or ancient. So Mosiah is presented as the king. He's basically Simbad in front of all the people, right? All right, yeah.
Yes, one
Hey,
is.
by the way, guys, this is your new king. And then the people are like, cool, that's our new king now. This isn't
Yay.
particularly Israelite. It's not particularly ancient. It's
Right.
fine. It follows the pattern. Like, I'm not disagreeing with with the Welches here, but I'm not seeing it. Okay,
Yeah.
receiving a throne name. So this is going to be kind of the sticking point in when we were talking about, like, really underhanded apologetics earlier in the
Mhm.
episode. This is where it shows
Ah,
up. So a royal name was given to the rulers over the Nephites in Jacob, right? So all of the kings that ruled over the Nephites after Nephi were also called Nephi, which is fine. It's a patrilineal name. They keep naming their kids Nephi, and then
right.
inexplicably, one of them is named Mosiah. We don't actually have any like connection that shows like why that change occurred. There's nothing in the narrative that
Mosiah's
substantiates that.
mom just was sick of that.
I guess, like maybe the kid that was named Nephi died and then Mosiah took over, but none of this is in the narrative, right? So like I'm
Right.
now making
It's
the Book of
all
Mormon more
assumption.
complex than it actually is.
Right.
Um,
I
we'll talk
wanted
about
to ask something about the name thing earlier, and I forgot to. Would it have been in Joseph's, I'm not going to say wheelhouse, but I will say realm of knowledge for the popes to take on a new name when they are popified? I don't know what you call it.
um, yeah. So in the popification of, I'm just going to assume the Latin here of the
I was like, is that a real word or did you just make that? It sounded really good if you made it up. I was going to roll with it.
um Yeah, so when he's installed as the Pope, and there is a term for that, would that have been known? I'm pretty sure that that would have been known and well understood at the time. Though Joseph was a Protestant and his milieu was Protestant. I mean, the Catholic Church had dominated European
Yeah.
politics for so long.
I guess I
Um,
just didn't know, would it be more likely he would look at that as
I,
being the or would he be would somebody at that point in time in America be that knowledgeable? I mean, I
okay,
guess
so
he's not that many steps back from being
I
in.
think you're giving Joseph too much credit here, actually, which is a thing. So let's go back to Mosiah 1 real quick.
Mhm,
In verse
mhm.
2, we have Benjamin, who has three sons, and he called their names Mosiah, Haloram, and Helaman. Right? Mosiah is named as Mosiah before he takes on the role as king. So when he's just the crown prince, he has the name Mosiah. That's the name
Mosiah.
that's given to him. He does not experience a name change in anywhere else. Like at no point in time, he like when he is installed as king, he is still Mosiah. He's Mosiah the second. He's the second Mosiah, right? You have Mosiah, Benjamin,
Hmm.
Mosiah, um, but he's still just Mosiah.
Right.
There's no name change going on here. Where with the
Okay.
popes, you would see an actual
You would
change in
see
the
that.
name.
Yeah.
This should be kind of raising some red flags, by the way, because remember that what the pattern is receiving a throne name, right? Receiving a name that's specifically attached to being the king.
Right.
And that doesn't happen here. We've just established, right, through this dialogue that that is not what occurs. The
Yeah.
verse that is referenced to support this is Mosiah 3:8. Let's go to Mosiah 3:8 because we're not told in this table what Mosiah 3:8 actually says. We're just told, let's go to Mosiah 3:8. This is what it is. And he shall be called Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Father of heaven and earth, the creator of all things from the beginning, and his father shall be called Mary. In case you didn't catch that, this isn't talking about Mosiah. This verse has nothing to do with Mosiah. Okay, so this is really underhanded apologetics, and
Yeah.
it's underhanded to the point that I now have to point out all the issues. Okay, so Mosiah 3a is talking about Jesus, not Mosiah. We're not receiving a new name. What the argument is here is that A new name is revealed to the people at the time of this coronation. That's what's going on here, silly critic. Benjamin is revealing this new name. Okay. Well, where did Benjamin get this name from? Where did he learn it?
Right.
Well, okay. In verse 2, earlier, when we're getting the context of this, we say that Benjamin says, I shall tell you, or the things which I shall tell you are made known unto me by an angel from God. In other words, an angel showed up to Moses or to Benjamin and said, "Hey, wake up, you sleepy, sleepyhead, wake up!" And then
He slapped me with some knowledge.
he wakes up. He's like, "Well, what do you guys want?" And then the angel says that we're going to Candy Mountain. And
Oh,
I
yeah, that's right. That was my favorite scripture mastery
Yep,
scripture.
and that's why they build a tower so that way they can go to Candy Mountain. Um,
That
no,
exactly.
so
Yes, I'm on board with my
it's
co-sign.
from the angel that he's getting this information about Jesus. Well, what he's told is that in that time not far distant, the Lord omnipotent, who is doing who's super great and all that, shall take on a tabernacle of clay and go forth among men. Right. So we have Adonai named here as this being that is going to take on flesh and come into the world and perform all sorts of miracles. And this is revealed from the angel. He shall be called Jesus Christ, the Son of
Yep.
God, the Father of heaven and earth. This is revealed from the angel. I need to really reiterate and drive home that it's the angel revealing this to Benjamin. We need to be very, very clear on
Clearly,
that. Okay, we're good, right? We're good. Okay, because we need to go back to the
I
small plates for a
think I
second here.
understand.
We need to go back to the small plates here because we also have, uh, you know, Jacob, who is getting these revelations of and having an angel come and visiting him. And he is told the name as well at this time by an angel and told all of this stuff. And then he delivers the small plates or sorry, he doesn't deliver the small plates to Benjamin. His descendants do. Amalekite gives the small plates to Benjamin, which means that Benjamin had in his possession this name already. Um, Now,
He's just
the
really
the
bad at
apologist
reading.
the apologist might be able to get away with saying that the name that's in there is Christ, not Jesus Christ, and it's Benjamin who says Jesus Christ, and so he's adding on that additional name. See, silly critic. Okay, that's fine. But if you want to run with that, then you have to deal with the fact that Christ is the Greek rendering of the term Mosiah, right? Christ means anointed one, the same way that Messiah means anointed one. So that would
Right.
have been a meaningless distinction.
Ahaha.
Also, the fact that
Wow.
his mother would be called Mary is also earlier. It's this whole thing that's in the vision of the tree of life. Like this
Well,
is
I
already
am.
revealed.
My smacks are gobbed.
So what this presents is not only are the apologists being super underhanded in saying that this like throne name pattern is somehow adapted by this like
Mhm.
revelation of name Jesus Christ to the people, which it's not. This has nothing to do with the coronation. This is now a revival sermon.
Right.
Um, that's the first thing. The second thing that gets presented is this narrative disconnect. You already have the name revealed. You already have this Messiah figure revealed over here. I mean, maybe the name Jesus doesn't show up. It shouldn't. But maybe the name Jesus doesn't show up and just Christ does. And then over here, you actually have it as Jesus Christ, which, yeah, it's not revealed, but the fact as well that Jesus reveals himself as Jesus Christ to
Right.
the brother of Jared is another issue. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's not going to be in the narrative until later, I'll grant, but still,
I
it's
mean,
its own issue.
yeah. One of
um,
many.
right. But yeah, so if you want to play those word games, then fine, play those word games, but you now have to deal with the fact that there is now a Greek name, a Greek term for Messiah showing up in your Reformed Egyptian text. and is somehow to be distinguished from the translation of the Hebrew term into the Reformed Egyptian that then would have gone into the English translation. So when you can deal with all of
So
that, then yeah,
then I'll listen.
it's driving me nuts.
But tell me, Tyler, how do you really feel about it?
Yeah, definitely annoyed. There is one last coronation pattern, and that is the divine adoption of the king. And there's this statement that by covenant all the people became God's sons and daughters on his right hand. Like, all right, so now we're going to take a literary dependency on the New Testament and call that part of the an adaptation for the Israelite pattern of coronating kings. Like,
Yeah.
all right, fine. It's just this is the sort of BS that shows up in apologetics that then causes me to be very dubious about everything else that they have to say. So here's Welch making this claim about coronations and all of that, and it is so egregiously bad that now I wonder if the man ever said anything honest that I can take as like an actual decent challenge as a
Yes.
critic whatsoever. Yeah, don't worry, Jack Welch is not yet at the point of being a Guy or a Muhlestein, but he's almost there.
I was gonna say, but oh man, he's pretty close.
Yeah, he's working his way to that. So is Peterson, to be honest with you.
Oh.
But again, Peterson is nice enough that I could sit down, have lunch with the guy, and have a wonderful chat with him. But in terms of like believing his apologetics, it's yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
So yeah, so all in all, like with this section, we have two lines of apologetics that I do find like they are interesting to explore. To get there, we have to go through some questionable claims of kind of like landed parallelomania, all the way over to the range of just being flat out underhanded and intellectually dishonest. And then we have a section that I think is a very beautiful treatise. And like Mosiah 4 is a fantastic chapter for the most part, especially when it's talking about the poor. And yeah, I just am frankly kind of in awe of that section overall. I think it's beautiful. Um, and it's unfortunately undercut by this other stuff and by the lived realities of how the people who claim to believe in this book are actually using it.
Right, I was gonna say the really, 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 really little amount of effort put into that.
Now, to be fair, Community of Christ, I think to the best of their ability, does a pretty good job with this. They make it a part of their mission statement. Yeah.
I don't consider them one and the same. I consider the
Yeah.
mainstream Brighamites.
I just kind of
totally other
slap
animal.
this. I kind of slap this label of the people who believe in this book as not really listening to it. So I needed to correct that. There is another organization that I think that does believe in this book that actually does a pretty good job of following this section.
Gotcha.
And there are members who believe in this book who take that section very seriously and who live it. Like individual members are sometimes really stepping up to the plate and doing it. And so credit to them in that. The institutional church, on the other hand, is not. And
Yeah.
when they take away like the tithing and the offerings of these members and then throw it into an account like Ensign Peak and all that, like I would call that robbing God, the way that they're doing it. I don't think that the men,
absolutely.
yeah, I don't think that the members of the church are robbing God and not paying tithes and offerings, or even in the way that they go about paying tithes and offerings or whatever else. But the way that the church is doing it, I think is. And that is in my own, very spicy, athey boy sort of way of saying, I think that's robbing God.
I don't know if it's angsty, if it's true.
That's fair. That's fair. All right, that does it. I think for Mosiah 1 through 6, we are getting into one of the more interesting stories ahead too when we get into the people of Zenith and that whole section. This is a cool little bit, and there's some fun stuff in it that I think really speaks to the worldview under which the Book of Mormon was written. Next section is fun for setting the stage for some other stuff, and I'm looking forward to it.
Me too, definitely.
All right. Well, if there is nothing else, then I think this is where we can adjourn. Thank you all so much for joining us this week. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share with Jack Welch, and anybody else we insulted in this episode, I suppose.
I was gonna say there's so many.
And yeah, we'll see you all next time for more Come Follow Me with Lolo and Perry. Thank you all.
Good night.